Welcome to today's James Bond Club Ireland podcast. I'm Paul Lally.
I'm Kevin O'Callaghan.
And I'm Sean O'Hare.
I'm Andy Watson.
And this episode, we have a very, very special guest. An absolute titan in the Bond community, continuation author of one of my favorite James Bond tomes, the James Bond Bedside Companion, and now author of a brand new book, a spin-off, a Felix Leiter spin-off called The Hook and the Eye. It is the one and only Raymond Benson. All right, welcome everybody to the James Bond Club Ireland podcast. This is a podcast where we love to explore Bond fandom and wherever possible with an Irish perspective. I'm Paul Lally. Anyone else, Sean?
Yes, my name is Sean O'Hare. How well done?
Kev?
I'm Kevin O'Callaghan.
And I'm Andy Watson.
And together we're going to bring you a really special episode today. We've got a very special guest. With us is, anyone who's a Bond fan will know this man, the legendary Raymond Benson. Welcome, Raymond, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So where does this podcast find you today? Whereabouts in the States are you?
I am outside of Chicago. We've lived here for 31 years.
Tremendous. Yeah, it's a lovely part of the States. I managed to get to Chicago a long time ago, but would love to go back. Have you ever been to Ireland as a matter of interest?
Sadly, no. I've traveled a lot for Bond, and when I was doing my books, I went to all my locations and things like that, but I never said anything in Ireland, so I never had a reason to go. But I'd love to go, and I hear it's beautiful, and I'm a big fan of Irish music.
I know you're a music fan.
Yeah.
You're a big Beatles and Jethro Tull fan.
I am indeed, very much. I'm friends with the band and wrote a little book about Jethro Tull. But
I heard that, yeah.
There's a lot of Celtic stuff that I like. That's Scottish and Irish, and like Mike Oldfield did a lot of stuff like that. And
that's right.
There's a American band called Tempest that does Celtic rock that's fantastic, and they do a lot of Irish stuff.
Okay.
A lot of jigs and reels and things like that. Makes you want to get up and dance.
I don't know them. I must check them out. But typically, when we leave the country, we kind of want to leave the jigs and reels behind us. Try something new. But look, you've got 4 spare bedrooms here if you want to ever come over. The problem is we'd probably talk the ears off you, but you'd be very welcome. Now, you say you haven't said any of your books there, and I've read your books and they're all wonderful. Your predecessor did in the Bond canonization did have a novel set in Ireland, which was John Gardner.
Right.
He set No Deals, Mr. Bond here.
Yes.
And there is actually
one of the good ones. One of the good ones in my opinion.
Yeah, not bad. And actually, Fleming does have a brief dalliance with Ireland in Diamonds Are Forever. There's a moment where Bond goes through Shannon Airport. There's actually quite a funny story because he says in it that Bond notices the I think he calls it cheap trinkets or trashy stuff that's on display for the GIs to buy. And the management at Shannon Airport got very offended, and they wrote to Fleming. And they said, actually, we sell very high quality Irish linen and blah, 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 blah. And Fleming wrote back, and I can send you a link to this story. Fleming wrote back, and he said he didn't want to cause any offense. And he said that he's sure the American GIs would buy the cheap stuff anyway, and that everyone else. So he kind of backhanded the compliment there.
Yeah, right.
But anyway.
Well, he was always very, he loved to point out the sort of weird stuff in other countries, like whenever he came to America, he pointed out, the weird fast food places and things like that, the strip clubs in Harlem and, the kind of sleazy stuff. And he did that kind of, thrilling cities, he did that everywhere he went.
Well, one of my personal favorites in the novels is the scene where he and Bond go uptown, up to Harlem in Live and Let Die. And for our Live and Let Die book review, I trace back. There's some great stuff online where you can find the pictures of the locations as it was back then, some of the vehicles, the Studelec and all that kind of stuff. You know, it's great fun, and the trains that they would have ridden on. It was great fun looking at that stuff. Before we continue, though, I must take a moment to fanboy out, and I realize we've only got an hour here, but I just want to say, Raymond, as a young boy, when I just discovered James Bond and I was getting into the films, there was a lot out there, and I was like, I couldn't make head nor tail at all. And then I found this.
Oh, yes.
In my local bookshop, and this is the one that I picked up. You can see how pristinely I kept it when I was 14, which is about 600 years ago now. But this is a brilliant book. This is the one that the slightly updated one from 1987 or 88. Look at that handsome young man in there.
Back when I had color in my hair, besides
yeah. But look,
before eyeglasses too.
It was so great. And you know what? For what I remember, for a school book review, I reviewed a Bond book, and you taught me how to sort of think a little bit critically with reading the books and everything. I mean, it was really fantastic. So I thank you very much. And you weren't even out of your 20s when you wrote that. Like, you were quite young.
That's right. The first edition came out. Well, I started it when I was 26, but it took 3 years to do. And it came out in America in '84, and I was 29 then.
Wow!
And the updated edition came out four years later. Yeah,
amazing.
4 years.
Excellent book. Yeah, I often refer back to it when we're doing our book reviews and stuff. Great.
It is really good. Yeah,
and it's got that great Graham Rye cover the UK edition there.
Often imitated as well, with people with their watches and water pistols and stuff like that they put on. It's a really beautiful cover. He did a great job.
Yeah, the American edition, it was kind of a dull cover. It's just the words, the James Bond Bedside Companion.
Oh, it's huge. It's a big print, yeah.
Yeah, the first one was maroon, and the updated one was silver. And they're all rare now. I mean, they're out of print and rare, although the eBook is available, and the eBook has been corrected somewhat. I went through, and they're back in the 80s, not all the information was available, and I had to find it where I could, and there were some mistakes made, there were some errors, so I corrected all those for the ebook in 2012, and wrote a new introduction to it. But people always ask me, are you ever going to update it or something? And I say, well, I can't, because it wouldn't be ethical. Because I've been on the other side of the line as an author for Bond. I can't critique the other authors or even the films now. So it's going to remain a relic of the 1980s, and a little gem. So hold on to it. Maybe worth
Cold War. I will.
It's got.
You could write in it to eBay buyer.
No, it's going to my sons, who I'm going to force educate in the world of Bond. That's what it's going to. But of course, the most exciting thing now, for anyone who may not know who you are, I mean, you've written over 40 books. You've written Bond continuation novels, Bond novelizations, Bond short stories. You obviously have written this tome. You are a legend in the Bond world, and you know more about Bond than probably anyone. And I would recommend that anyone who wants to know more about Bond, who wants to delve into the literary Bond, please look into Raymond's work. It's been fantastic. And the most exciting thing is now that after many, many years, we have, it was 2002 was the last time you wrote a Bond?
The last one was 2002, that's correct.
Right.
And so, I'm back in bondage.
You are back in bondage. And with the spin-off that we all have been wanting, it's a Felix Leiter book. So The Hook and the Eye. So let me just read a little bit from the blurb from the ianfleming.com. Felix Leiter, James Bond's trusted friend and ally, takes center stage in a brand new adventure by legendary Bond novelist Raymond Benson. It's 1952. Felix has lost his job at the CIA and finds himself working for the Pinkerton Detective Agency. What starts as a simple surveillance job turns into a matter of life and death when Felix stumbles upon a murder and a cabal of spies embedded in Manhattan. Now, I won't say any more than that, but we're very excited because this is a period piece. This is back in 1952. Now, some people will talk about the timelines on that, but I think another excellent book here by John Griswold really looks at the timelines of when things actually happened in the book. So 1952 is roundabout exactly after Felix has had his shark attack.
That's right. That's right. I did use John's book to set the timeline, and I give him credit in the author's note acknowledgments at the beginning of the book, explaining why this is 1952. Some people will think, well, gee, Live and Let Die was published in 1954 and Diamonds Are Forever was 56. They didn't take place then. That's when they were published, because Fleming, conceived it almost a year and a half before he wrote, each book and wrote the book a year before it was published. So yeah, 52 kind of works out, especially with there's certain clues that John Griswold gives and points out with each book that determines kind of when, it's a good guess, let's say, and it worked out for me because 1952 has some pivotal historical moments in it that play into the plot.
I've heard this and I'm like, should I Google that or should I just wait and be surprised?
We'll wait.
We're all very excited about this, so I'm going to have to tag team you with questions at the moment. So Sean and Kev, we're going to hand over to you. You've got a load of questions up your sleeves as well.
Okay. I was smiling a little bit personally because I have a very close family relative who was born in 1952. So I'm very hopeful maybe that gets included, Raymond, in the book as a big marker historically. I know it might be for them, maybe. But I think, as Paul was saying, we're really thrilled that you're looking at Felix as kind of a new ground in a way, and also kind of familiar ground, I suppose. Was this something that was going around in your mind for a while, or was it suggestions, or how did we get to starting the book even?
Yes and yes and yes. After I had done my Bond books back in 2002, a few years went by, and I think Charlie was doing the Young Bond books and stuff. And I pitched, I wanted to do a Felix Leiter novel. I've always wanted to do a Felix Leiter novel because I love Felix Leiter because, he is a Texan and I am a Texan. I was born in Texas. And I never felt that the films ever did Felix justice. He's a more well-drawn character in Fleming's books. And, we never saw him with his prosthesis in the films. And I wanted to explore that. And if he was in Pinkertons, the CIA kicks him out after they offer him a desk job and he doesn't want that. So he joins Pinkertons as a detective, So here we are. If it's the 1950s, then it's perfect for like this sort of noir, detective stuff, trench coat, cigarettes, and all this kind of 1950s milieu. And I thought, this is perfect. I'd love to do this. But, at the time, Ian Fleming publications weren't, that wasn't in their wheelhouse at the time. And I think I pitched it again around, 2011 or so, 2012. And again, it wasn't in their wheelhouse. But more recently, since they started doing more spinoffs, like Kim Sherwood's books. Yeah. And there's a new Q novel coming out. That's right, yeah. Things like that. I thought, well, why not pitch it again? And I did. And they went, yes, this is exactly kind of what we were thinking about. And they had in mind to do a serial, kind of in the Pulp Fiction kind of way, So they are, publishing this in a very unique and new way. It's an experiment. We're going to see how it goes, but it's something they wanted to do, and I was all for it. So it's going to be an eBook first, in a serial format. So it'll be kind of like a mini series that you watch on Netflix. In fact, I'm going to record little unpacking the episode videos that you can watch after each episode drops. And stuff.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. We'll probably be making mini pods reviewing each piece as we go along as well.
And then you know the paperback will come out in the fall in October. So I wanted to do it, and I always had in mind I wanted to my Bond books were set in modern times. That was kind of by directive, but I really wanted to set this in Fleming's timeline, so it fits right in between Live and Let Die and Diamonds Are Forever. Kind of at the same time that Bond is doing Moonraker. So Felix is over here in America doing The Hook in the Eye. And that was my concept. And the people at IFP loved it. And the board went nuts about it. So.
Good. Well, just following off on that, Raymond, you were saying it's set in the Fleming timeline. How was it like writing in Fleming's timeline? Did you feel it liberating, or was there a challenge in terms of sticking to certain things, or were you just given carte blanche and away you go?
Well, the challenge was the research, was the time, the period research. Yeah, I was very familiar with all the locations I picked for the book. I lived in New York City for many, many years, and the first third of the novel takes place in Manhattan. So the trick there, a lot of the streets and the buildings are all still the same.
Really?
The geography is the same. The only thing that's different is there's different restaurants, there's different businesses, things like that. Things were a little different in terms of public transportation and stuff like that. So I had to research that. The second third of the book is a road trip across America. And it's a road trip along a route that I have personally done 3 times in my life. So I knew the route, and I just, again, had to do the research of what was there along the road, what kind of motels and hotels and restaurants or, fast food places that you would eat along the way, and how, what were the challenges of driving a car cross country in 1952 as opposed to today, that kind of thing. And then the last third is in Texas. So,
it's rich,
it's home territory.
It really is kind of rich mid-century Americana. The sort of stuff that we love from Live and Let Die, like the train ride, the jazz clubs uptown that Felix takes Bond to. I'm so, because that's the kind of buzz that just set me alight when we were doing our book review of Live and Let Die. It was so fascinating to delve into all of that. So I'm already sort of hyped for your perspective on that and what you bring to it as well. I can't wait to see it.
Right. The tagline on IFP's site is really hits the nail on the head. It's a mystery. It's a romance. It's a spy story. It's a road trip tale, and it's a postcard to a lost Americana.
Raymond, I'm curious. Was there any part of Felix, when you look at his character and you're kind of rediscovering him in the timeline, and was there a part of him you kind of wanted to change or to fix or morph into who we find in the book eventually?
Well, I give him more, because Fleming only gave us so much. We know a little bit about where he came from. He was in the Marines. He was working for the CIA in Paris when Bond first meets him in Casino Royale. Beyond that, we really don't know much about his earlier life, except that he came from Texas. And so, I think, there's a brief mention of a sister in Diamonds Are Forever, just a throwaway line almost. You can almost miss it. So I get to flesh all that out. I get to flesh out his background and his home and parents and things like that. So, and again, Fleming's Felix, we've I don't want to denigrate any of the fine actors that have played him on screen, but we've never seen Fleming's Felix. We never have, really. I mean, you know, and they're all different. And they all have different tones to their character. You know, Felix in the books, when you read his relationship with Bond, he's a joker. He's so buoyant and happy-go-lucky all the time. He's constantly mansplaining America to Bond. You know, like, oh, we got to go out and do this. We got to go to Harlem and do that. We got to order this on the menu. You know, here, try this drink. You're going to love it. You know, and stuff like that. I mean, he's so exuberant and kind of a funny guy. You know, in Diamonds Are Forever, he first enters the scene. He comes up behind Bond on the street and sticks his hook in his back and goes, you know, stick him up, that kind of thing. You know, he's kind of a goofball. Yeah.
He's got the kind of black humor as well, you know, pointing him with his own hook, you know? Yeah. Yes.
So that's the Felix I do, you know, the novel is also in first person from his point of view.
That's something I meant to mention to you as well. That's, I think, the first time we've seen that, isn't it? That's going to be very exciting. A first-person Felix Leiter experience. I can't wait to see that. But go ahead, Sean, and
Kevin. No, well, I was just going to very quickly just follow on from that point that you're making, Raymond, in terms of Felix with his hook and the shark attack. You've said it probably. Is it from his rehabilitation, I'm assuming, is going to be interlinked within the story? Could you tell us a wee bit about the thought process there?
Right. So it begins right after it begins during his rehabilitation. We don't spend a lot of time on it, but we learn about how he's fitted for his prosthesis and the kind of prosthesis. You know, it's funny. Fleming always described it as a hook. You know, when I was a kid in the 1960s reading the books for the first time, I envisioned a pirate hook, you know, which of course would be wrong. You know, I don't know if you're familiar with the movie The Best Years of Our Lives from 1946. It's an Oscar-winning Best Picture post-World War II movie. And there's an actor in it named Harold Russell who has both arms are prostheses.
Right.
They're little pincher hooks.
Yeah.
And
they're more like pinchers than hooks, aren't they?
Yeah. They're pinchers. Yeah. He won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for this movie. And that's exactly what Felix would have had, because he would have been outfitted by the Veterans Administration, which had outfitted this character in The Best Years of Our Lives. So
that's a great reference to check for a visual cue.
Yeah, and that was it's only like 6 years later. So it would, and I did consult a prosthetics doctor who knew his history, and he said there wouldn't have been much change in prosthetics since that late 40s. You know, it's still the early 50s. So that's what Felix would have had. And, you know, it's all done, you know, he has a harness on, and it's all the manipulation and raising his arm and moving his arm and opening and closing his thing. It's all done by shoulder flexion.
Wow.
Yeah. It's not motorized at all.
Oh my God.
And he also has a part of a wooden leg as well. So I deal with all of that. And then I have to deal with his rehabilitation and learning how to do things like drive and shoot a gun with his left hand, which he's never done before. And practicing doing that. And then, you know, he goes back to New York and finds out that the CIA doesn't want him anymore. Well, they say, you know, you can have a desk job when he doesn't want that. So
I can imagine. I think that's something that's really, really interesting, because we're often seeing, you know, villains with disabilities, and sometimes the Bond series, particularly the movies, gets criticized for, you know, constantly giving a villain a disability. But in this case, you have the hero with a disability and experiencing the challenges of, like, many veterans who come back and are disabled in one sense or another, reintegrate into society, find their role for themselves. And this is what Felix knows. one of the things I like about the No Time to Die film is when Felix and Bond, exchange that thing where it is a good life. So that's why they find their purpose. They find their purpose in what they're doing, I think. And I think it's important for Felix to do that. So the way that you're exploring that is very exciting. I can't wait to read more about that. But I think it's really important that you put that in.
And then, there's also the relationship with women. How will his disabilities affect that? And so he has to, explore. The book does explore that. So
cool, great. Sean, what else did you have?
Yeah, I'm just touching on another point we've probably said already, but you're talking about cars, and I know throughout the novels of Fleming, Felix had a love of cars, and I'm assuming with a road trip across America, there will be a number of cars in this novel, I'm assuming.
Cars are very important in the story. Yeah.
Good. Okay, good.
and there will, you've heard of the Studilac. So, I don't know if this will give anything away, but in real life, the Studilac didn't start being produced until 1953. But Felix learns about it. And so we get a scene where he actually goes and meets the man who designed the Studilac. I found out who it was and where he was located. And Amazing. It was on Long Island in New York. And Felix goes to visit him and orders his Studilac, so so we get the Studilac in the book, but
that's great.
He doesn't get to drive it yet.
Nice workaround. But so there was only one guy making them, putting these Cadillac engines in the Studebaker.
Yeah, it was a custom made oddity.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Brilliant.
It's a great looking car. I mean, there are images of it online. It is cool looking 1950s. I mean, easily, like, it would be a great car to drive today. Maybe.
Oh, I'm sure it would. There weren't many made. And actually, he didn't make any convertibles. But the one Felix is driving in Diamonds Are Forever is a convertible. I think Fleming took a little license with that. But I have Felix say, "Oh, can't you make me a convertible? You can do one, can't you?" Well, okay, don't tell anybody.
That's brilliant.
I might be jumping ahead here, Raymond, but I mean, I know it's going to get asked once the serialization starts and the book comes out. Is there thoughts of this being a one-off or the beginning of something or more? You because you're mentioning how it's been kind of going around your head for close to 20 years. Is there another one rattling about in there somewhere?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, right now it's one book.
It's done.
I suppose we'll see how it goes, but that's all the plans we have right at the moment. That's all.
I guess it's like the marathon runners, I suppose. Once you're done the marathon, never again. I won't do that for a while and just give it time, and then maybe, who knows? It's wonderful though. Wonderful. I also wanted just to ask, just in terms of your research, because you seem to enjoy researching this. How much of a joy was it going in and finding out, the guy with the Studilac and the restaurants and the streets of New York?
The research is one of the most enjoyable things of writing a book. Gosh, when I was doing Bond back in the 90s and early 2000s, the internet was still pretty in its infancy at that time. We didn't have Google Maps, where you can take that little guy down on the street and walk through Paris, You had to go. And I did. I went to my locations and I experienced the hotels and the food and the sights and the sounds and the smells that Bond would have in these places. So that it was a lot of work, but it was great fun too. And very, a learning experience as well, because these were places, some of them were places I never thought I'd go to, like, Corsica.
Nice.
And I was so glad I did. Corsica's fantastic, so any of this kind of stuff. I mean, I did a series of books called The Black Stiletto. I don't know if you've heard of those.
Yes.
It's a 5-book serial where it's really kind of one big story, but it's divided into 5 books. And it takes place in the late 50s, early 60s in America, as well as in the present day. And, I had to research the time period for that as well. And it was a lot of fun doing that. Contacting people, people were still alive then.
Yeah.
But finding people around that were adults in 1952 is a little harder. It's just it's a treasure hunt. It's like
do you like to do your research in situ, as it were? Go to the places rather than just read about them.
Right. Exactly. Certainly back then, if it was places that I'd never been. A lot of my books now, my own original books, take place mostly in locations where I have lived. A lot of writers, they say write what you know, and a lot of writers do that. They write, Stephen King almost always sets his stories in Maine, where he lives.
Yeah.
And there was a British writer, Ruth Rendell, who was one of my favorite writers. She was a fantastic mystery writer. She always wrote about these little small English country towns because that's where she lived.
Yeah. That's brilliant.
So in this case with Felix, I did pick again places I was really familiar with. I just had to do the research on the time period.
Yeah. And having written for the sort of Bond and Felix for the 90s and for the 50s, I mean, you're researching the character, I guess, in both instances, but is there a difference? I mean, I know, for example, there's often been, an observation that kind of Bond and Felix are almost an avatar for Britain and America and the special relationship, for example. Is that something that you feel is true, or is it just a thing between them? Or, was there a difference in doing it for your 90s novels versus doing it for this particular period novel?
Well, let's step back to Ian Fleming. I believe that Fleming was boosting up Britain with Bond after the war because Britain had become third place. There was America, there was the Soviet Union, and then there was Britain. And so he was making Bond, the hero, and Felix was kind of the supporting, second banana.
Yeah.
And, Fleming got along great with Americans. He had great American friends. I got to know Ernest Cuneo, who was Fleming's closest American
muse.
friend.
Yeah.
And he and I were really close in the 1980s until he died. And he told me all kinds of stories. And I totally believe that the kind of relationship that Fleming had with Cuneo was exactly the same relationship that Bond had with Felix. They went out drinking a lot. They went out to bars and restaurants and were always guying each other, and kidding each other and daring each other to do this or that. And, and having a lot of laughs.
Yeah.
So there's that. Now, today, the situation has changed as geopolitically, So
we don't need to go too deep into that because it's so tenuous.
A whole other podcast in that.
I want to stay away from that. And believe me, But when I was doing my Bonds, I used Fleming's character, but I certainly modernized him. I had him with an electronic mechanical prosthesis, and a wheelchair that he often uses because by his age, maybe he might need to use a wheelchair every now and then, but he could still walk if he wanted to.
Sure.
So that was kind of realistic, but also a little flight of fancy as well.
Yeah.
So when you were doing your Bonds, did you ever face any editorial restrictions from the Fleming estate, or did they just give you free rein?
Well, when I was coming up with the stories, the plots, I was required to submit an outline first of what I wanted to do. And none of those were ever rejected. I always got my way. They might make a little suggestion here and there. They might go, this little bit here we're not so sure about that. You might want to rethink that little section, or something like that. But they were, the plot, the full-scale plot, they never rejected.
So they were happy enough with the modern times as well, then, rather than continuations.
I'm sorry?
They were happy enough with, like you say, Felix having an electric chair and stuff. So they were happy enough with things like that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they thought that was all fine. When I first started, who Peter Jansen Smith is. Yeah. He was the chairman of Ian Fleming Publication. Yeah. It was called Glidrose then. Yes. And he was Ian Fleming's literary agent. So he was the boss. He was the one I was dealing with at the time. And when he asked me to do the books, we had a talk about what direction we should do. Should I just continue on in contemporary times from John Gardner, or should we go back to the 60s or the 50s, And this happened to be in early November of 1995. And suddenly GoldenEye comes out. And there's this huge mega hit, And so it was Peter who said, let's keep it in sync with the movies, let's keep it modern. Yeah. And he wanted me to make M a woman.
Okay, wow.
Coincide with the movies.
Wow.
Yeah. And he also said, see if you can kind of bring in a little bit more of the cinematic sensibility, the more, more action, a little more humor, kind of make it feel like an Eon movie in a way, but stay close to Fleming, stay in the spirit of Ian Fleming. And I said, that I can do that, but I want to keep my Bond with all his vices intact. I want him to smoke.
It must have been being torn everywhere to get all of that in one go.
Yeah, I want him to womanize still and all that. He's the misogynistic dinosaur. And they said, if you can do it, and I did, I think. So that's how that went. So I would give them the outline, and it would also, Peter had to approve it. But also the British publisher at the time, who they had a contract with, had to approve it, and the American publisher had to approve it. So I was, had these three entities that were looking at my stuff, and and then this was just at the very beginning. I had to write the first 4 chapters of the first book on spec for everybody to approve as well.
Okay, right.
And then once that was done, then all I had to do was submit an outline for every book. And then I was off to the races. Then I would turn in the book, and then it would go through an editorial process, just like any book with any editor. Peter would give his comments, and, if there were any things I needed to work on, I would. And then it would go to the British publisher, and then it would go to the American publisher, and they would all have comments and edit. It was like, eventually, I didn't have any hair, but.
So when you're going through that writing process about Bond, which of the Bond, or who do you have in your mind as Bond when you're writing it?
That's a question I get asked a lot. I grew up with Sean Connery. To me, for me and my age, I saw the first movies on the big screen. I'm that old, so but I'm lucky that way too. I think experiencing them when they first came out was just mind-boggling. That's why I'm so corrupted today. But when I read the books, and I read them as a kid first in the 60s, and I didn't understand a lot of them, but I grasped the plots, I grasped the story, and then I reread them again when I was older, and reread them again. But even from that very beginning, when I first read them in the 1960s, I didn't picture Sean Connery in the book. It just didn't seem right. And I pictured some sort of nebulous, shadowy guy. In fact, he kind of looked like the John McCluskey drawing from the Daily Express.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of who I picture today still when I read a Bond novel, even new Bond novels. And so when I'm writing my book, that's who I picture.
That's quite a craggy face, isn't it? It's even craggier than Daniel Craig. The McCluskey face is very...
And then interestingly, when readers would come up to me and they'd say, "Oh, I can really hear Pierce Brosnan say those lines," or "I can hear Sean Connery say those lines," or "I can hear Timothy Dalton say those lines." The readers are putting their Bond into their head when they read it, and so if that worked for them, then I succeeded, I guess.
That's a win. They're projecting their image of Bond onto what you're writing, that's a great success. I mean, wow.
I'm going to ask you. I'm just going to jump in because you've made me think of a question, which is Fleming used to get people writing to him saying, maybe you should correct this or change this or do that. Has that happened to you? How often does that happen? Any good story there you can tell us in terms of
that started with the James Bond Bedside Companion. People would write right and say, "Oh, you got that wrong," and that's why I made corrections later. Things like that. Oh yeah. There's quite a bit of that goes on. What can you do?
Okay.
Everybody makes mistakes.
Nobody's perfect.
Even Ian Fleming. So
we often write our suggestions to Kev.
And like Fleming, you write to each one of them and have a conversation.
Well, usually, if they're nice about it, then I will.
Yeah.
Any Jeffrey Boothroyds then out there making suggestions that you've actually taken on board? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just go back briefly, though, to Ernest Cuneo? Because I actually, the first time I heard about him was in your book, The Bedside Companion. But I think it is very interesting that you point out that his relationship with Fleming is a sort of a potential parallel between Bond and Felix. And maybe, I don't know, Ivor Bryce as well. When you read about them in the Fleming biographies, these are the names that come up. And I like the way you point out that they had a kind of a cheeky friendship, and Cuneo was a bit of a provocateur. And then he gives him the name Ernie Cureo, I think. Curio. And then he credits him as a muse as well.
Yes.
And I just, you can equally see the two of them going into a jazz club, getting sozzled and having a lot of fun.
They did. Yeah, they did.
Because it's great the way you can have that kind of liberty in the 1950s. I'm not sure, is it really? Could you imagine two intelligence officers today going day drinking to jazz clubs and staying out all night in order to investigate bad guys? Maybe that's a thing. I don't know. But
I think in the 50s it would have. In the 50s, sure.
Which is why it's great, and which is why it's fun to go back to that period and explore it again, right?
Yeah. And I knew Ivor Bryce as well.
Yeah, you did, of course.
And Felix was his middle name.
Right. And what were they like? What were you able to garner from those two that really gave you an insight into Fleming's relationships and the way he thought and the way he would, pick things from experiences and put them into the writing?
I knew Ernie the best because he was American and he lived not far from he lived in Washington, D.C. and I lived in New York. And after we became friends and he wrote the introduction to my book and the book came out, he would call me almost every week just to chat. I think he might have been lonely. I don't know. He was very sort of a gregarious guy, Italian.
Yeah.
He had a lot of political influence in the day. He was kind of the liaison between Bill Stevenson and Ray Donovan. What's his name? Bill Donovan.
Yeah, for the CIA. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was also a liaison to the White House. So he knew FDR. He knew J. Edgar Hoover.
He also knew that famous journalist who
Drew Pearson and Walter Winkel.
Yes.
And part of his job, part of his intelligence work was feeding propaganda to those guys, to those journalists, so that they could broadcast them.
That's amazing.
There's an excellent book that just came out called The Invisible Spy. It's by a guy named Thomas Mayer, and it's a biography of Ernest Cuneo. So you should look that up, and it really goes into the Fleming relationship as well.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone is interested in any kind of mid-century politics, the nice kind of politics, the interesting kind, the post-war kind. that's really fascinating. The development of the CIA and the relationship, as you say, between America and Britain, when Fleming and the Beatles did a lot to give Britain a lot of soft power.
Listen, the 1960s, the Beatles and Bond were Britain's biggest exports.
Right.
And I was totally a fan, totally into that. The Beatles and Bond in the 1960s. Now, Ivor Bryce, I didn't know as well. I spent a weekend with him at his home in England. And then I saw him again once in New York when he came to visit Ernest, his wife. You know, it's interesting. His wife lived in New York and he lived in England.
Talk about separate bedrooms. That's
They had separate mansions, you know. So
that's how the best marriages work, isn't it?
I guess so. So I got to know her too. That was Jo Bryce. You've heard of Jo Bryce, and she owned Black Hole Hollow Farm. And Fleming would always come to Black Hole Hollow Farm whenever he was in America, and that's the area where The Spy Who Loved Me takes place, and the short story For Your Eyes Only was in that area of New York, upstate New York and Vermont. So I visited Black Hole Hollow Farm, and I slept in the bed that Fleming slept in.
Wow!
Which was,
cool.
I was haunted by ghosts the whole time. But Ivor was he was toward the end of his life. He was very frail, but he still had, his mind, and he was very pleasant and very soft-spoken. He really enjoyed meeting me, and when I was visiting him, he pulled out a stack of letters for me and Fleming, let me read them all and go through them all. So it was, I felt very privileged and honored that I got to know these guys.
That's incredible.
And there were some other of Fleming's, friends like Robert Harling, and researching the Bedside Companion. I really stepped into Fleming's world in that one. I got to know, his family members as well as a lot of his friends then, and they're all, a lot of them are no longer with us.
That's the thing. You really managed to get, that golden period where, there was a little bit of perspective between, there was almost 30 years since the first book at that point. But those people were still around and could still talk about Fleming. And of course, he's such a fascinating character in his own right. I mean, it shows with Nicholas Shakespeare's recent biography as well. We're all very envious of you having managed to do that. But just chatting about them now, it's just super exciting, because we've, read so many books and articles and Wikipedia entries and everything on the subject. And it's just amazing to talk to someone who was there in the thick of it, talking to these people,
Right. I even met Kevin McClory.
Well, there you go. Tell us about that. What did you think of Kevin?
Another gregarious type.
Yeah.
This was in the early 80s. He was right in the middle of Never Say Never Again.
Yes.
So he was a very busy guy, but I spent an afternoon with him, and then I spent another period riding with him in his limo from Manhattan to the airport, where we could sort of finish up our talk. Those were the only really two instances, but I got enough for my book anyway. He was a character, I'll put it that way.
Yes, I feel like you're being diplomatic there. I recently heard Martine Beswick say, actually, she was on the Really 007 pod, and she said she had great fun with Kevin McClory. They were like drinking buddies, and I was like, oh, I'm sure he did, because he was probably having a rare old time getting his film made.
I'm sure. Back in the day, I'm sure he was a really fun guy to be around, because. He was a handsome guy. He dated Elizabeth Taylor, for God's sake. He was kind of a player, and very much, knowing he was he knew the who's who of Hollywood and people, things like that. I'm sure that he was a very charismatic fellow, and he was. Even when I met him, so I can understand how attractive he could be.
And he certainly had that draw, because his where we used to live, a place called Straffan House here is a big complex now. There's a beautiful hotel there and stuff like that. But at one point, he have this circus style charity fundraiser that he did, and he invited Sean Connery as well and Eric Clapton. There's a thing out there on YouTube. It's a very bizarre event. It looked like maybe they were all off their wonk on mushrooms. I'm not sure, but you know, a lot of people came and did some weird stuff, but it was for charity, and there's a bit on YouTube. But he seemed to be the kind of guy who could get people to just do things. And I'm not, you know, so, but, you know, in his defense, I think, you know, there's an argument to be made if Fleming kind of pinched his story, then, you know, he's probably going to want a bit of kickback on that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I kind of go into it in the Bedside Companion, and I was actually hired by Eon in the 1999 court case to be a expert witness.
I didn't know that.
So I had to write up some documents, which I guess they ended up not using.
Right.
I mean, it's a very complicated situation.
Sure.
Yeah. You know, Ernest Cuneo was very much involved in that, and Ivor Bryce was very much involved in that.
Yeah.
You know, that weekend that all of them kind of came up with the story, and I read all the treatments and all the screenplays and all the, you know, I read Cuneo's initial draft. It was his story. He's the one that came up with it.
Right.
You know, that's why Fleming said Ernest Cuneo muse at the beginning of that novel.
That's true, yeah.
But you know, a lot of people worked on it. Jack Whittingham, of course, and you know, it would be. I don't know how that court case would have turned out if they hadn't settled.
Yeah,
you know, right. Fleming was not well, and Ivor Bryce. It was kind of up to Ivor Bryce, and Bryce just said, you know, let's throw in the towel, let's settle, and see what we can do. Because he didn't want to drag it out. It was just, you know, it was very hard on Fleming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very hard. The stress on him and he was unhealthy as it was. But that seems to have, I think the general consensus is that certainly did not help his situation.
Yeah. I mean, you know, Kevin, I'm sure contributed some valuable stuff to the story because he lived in the Bahamas. Yeah. You know, I'm sure he had a lot to say about underwater stuff and Bahamas stuff and things like that. But this is just me talking.
Yeah.
I'm convinced the story is Fleming's. You know, the story is it's such a Fleming style story.
Yeah.
And you know, the special executive for counterintelligence, terrorism, revenge, and extortion. That is so Fleming.
Very funny. Yeah.
And because of the whole legal contracts and everything, Kevin is a part of it. And so when it became in dispute, he had a contractual right.
Yeah.
So that's just my opinion.
But hey, if it wasn't for McClory, we'd never have had the amazing Never Say Never Again that everybody loves so much.
Hey, you know,
I'm being a bit cheeky there.
I don't knock it. In fact, in 1983, I thought it was. I was happy with it. I thought it was a breath of fresh air, and it was great to see Connery back.
Great to see Connery back, Fandom and Blush. But there's a lot of fun in that film.
Yeah, but Thunderball is one of my favorites. Thunderball is magnificent.
Raymond, you are a man of excellent taste because it is my favorite film. Well, I've spent the last 5 months talking about how wonderful it is.
Thunderball is the peak of Bond mania.
Yes,
it is. Yeah. It is the most. It is the movie that sold the most tickets. You know, they say that Skyfall is like the number one Bond movie or something, but that's, you know, not adjusting for inflation.
Inflation, sure.
Thunderball, if you had been there in 1965 to see what a phenomenon that was, you know, it was like Star Wars in 1977. You know, it was a huge, huge blockbuster. And, you know, when it was released for Christmas, 1965, you had to have reserved seats to see it in theaters.
Wow.
You know,
I still do in my house. Still have to reserve a seat here. Sorry,
we had a screening of it. When was it? March. We had a screening for it, and we had some guys over for it from the UK. February, and it was so great. I mean, we were just trying in our small way to recreate some of the epic nature of that film on the big screen, you know. And it's funny when you see it on the big screen, you notice small things like the guy coming up at the end during the climactic fight who arrives up with some champagne in his hand to serve I don't know whom. You know, Largo needs his champagne mid-fight, but it's a great film. It's a stylish film. It's a good-looking film. The characters are brilliant. It's so easy to go back to. I mean, we all have a lot of love for Thunderball here.
Oh. Yeah. Well, you know, I love all the '60s movies.
Yeah. They're Rick Van Nutter is your favorite Leiter actor. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think. He resembles what Fleming wrote. You know, Leiter's supposed to be tall and blonde.
Yeah.
He's the only tall and blonde actor that played Leiter, so and he was pretty good too, and he kind of has that sort of kidding kind of quality to him. So he was okay. I mean, you know, I like him all right. He's my favorite. Yeah.
So if you were looking on that as from the past, what about for the future? I personally, I think Austin Butler would be a great Felix.
Oh, well, you know, I probably shouldn't name actors because, I've never been supposed to do that. Even when I was doing Bond, you know, people would say, well, who would you want to play this villain? You know, I'm not supposed to say. Yeah. Because it could give, tabloids, oh, well, Raymond Benson says so-and-so should be, this actor. And then, it becomes a big thing, and then you hear about it for months. On social media. But I do have my ideas. So.
Yes,
we'll
edit this together.
We'll wait until we switch off the recording, and then you can tell.
Would you be happy to see a Felix spin-off, maybe under the new Amazon thing in the film world?
Well, sure. And
would you love it to be based on your own story?
That would be great. However, mine is a period piece.
Yeah.
So, I'm sure if they do this, they're going to make a modern Bond film. I'm sure, probably. Yeah. So they'll have a modern Felix in it. And if they do a spinoff, they're going to use that Felix. So it'll all be tied together like Marvel, and everything. So who knows? Maybe I wrote myself into a corner.
Well, at this stage, if we're going to be made to accept that Bond can be killed in one iteration and then can be, appear again, I'm willing to suspend my disbelief enough to imagine that there's a parallel universe where we can have both a period Felix and a modern Bond and Felix relationship too.
Well, that'd be great. I'd love it. So,
what a great idea as well if you're going into a little TV miniseries. We've got a serial now coming out in the next 2 weeks or so to get started. I mean, we got a nice template there we could follow. Very cool to see that. So who knows?
Amazon, in the extraordinarily unlikely scenario that you're listening, we're available for pitching ideas.
We'll totally talk about that later.
Right. Raymond, I think maybe we've used up your time. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. We're really thrilled. And are you going to be touring like as a sort of a publicity going around? Will you be in the UK?
We've talked about maybe me coming over in October when the physical book comes out. I guess it kind of depends on how things are.
Sure. Well, you've got 4 definite purchases here, right? Definitely.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
And we will be in London in October, actually, because there's a Bond event in the O2. Is it not the O2 this time? But there's a Bond music event, Cue the Music, we're going to go to. So we'll keep an eye on your dates because I've never met you in person. I'd love to do that. And if not, I hope we talk soon at some point. It would be really amazing.
Well, someday, maybe in Ireland.
That would be brilliant. That would be great.
Perfect.
That would be great.
More than welcome.
With a picture of a pint of Guinness in front of you.
All right.
I hope you've enjoyed your time. We certainly have. It's been a real privilege. I cannot wait to read the book. We'll do a review of it when we come out. And I do hope we can talk again soon, Raymond.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed meeting you all.
All right. Thanks, Raymond.
Thank
Have
you,
a great
Raymond.
day. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Talk to you soon. Wow. Well, what did you think of that, Sean?
Amazing. I cannot believe we've just spoken to the man, the legend that is Raymond Benson.
Yeah.
The man has done 3 novelizations of my favourite films, the Brosnan era. Oh, I can't believe we spoke to him. Amazing.
He's great. He's great. And he's such a easy chatter. Like he'll happily talk about anything to do with Bond. So knowledgeable and great. Andy, what did you think?
I thought it was a fantastic chat. He let out some great insights into the Bond authorship in general. Yeah. And I think people will be really impressed by what they're going to listen to.
Kev, did you enjoy that?
If you haven't told, I've been fanboying pretty much all that way through that conversation. I'm just looking at him and I go, it's Raymond Benson. It's for all our really 007 friends, it's the Benson for them. So I loved hearing the stories about the kind of the Fleming friends and him meeting him and discussing and the research that went into the Bedside Companion. And of course, like Sean saying, I mean, who doesn't have a Raymond Benson sitting up on the shelf behind them? Look at. So it was just wonderful and so generous with his time and with his stories and with his legacy himself for this. So I'm looking forward to the new book, which is coming out at the end of the month.
Yeah. Now, if you don't have a Raymond Benson sitting on the shade, serialized. That's true. It'll be serialized first. But if you don't have a Raymond Benson sitting on your shelf, that's no shade. But do get out there and rectify it straight away. Whether you pick up one of his continuation novels, or whether you pick up the Bedside Companion, or whether you go straight to this, obviously the serialized Felix Leiter, he's a joy to read. Always really, really great. I had a great time as well. It was so nice to meet someone who had written a book that I had such an affection with as a child. You know, as a teenager, this was something that I had. It was literally my bedside companion for years. It was really, really brilliant. I would encourage everyone to go out and get this book. Who knows? Maybe it'll be the start of something more to come. Maybe not. Yeah. Anyway, that's it from us on James Bond Club Ireland. Thank you very much for listening. We look forward to seeing you in the next one. Talk to you soon.
See you all soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.